Steve, now that we're doing this monthly series that hopefully will expand in a bunch of different ways, I haven't quite come up with the proper set of branding or introduction. So let's just be very direct in this early draft stage. Welcome to the Marshall and Steve show, or the Steve and Marshall show, based on our actual credentials, depending on how you want to pick your poison there. But
I think now that I'm in your genre, you come first. So I'm in your space. So I'm the subordinate here.
So fair. When for future notice, when we're on panels, you will go first. When we're on podcasting Zoom rooms galore, I can get pride of place. Let's just kind of start here. So from an editorial perspective, we could have done a version of this episode where it's like, okay, Steve, like, what do you think about the early voting results? It seem to be favoring Republicans in Nevada, but that's not our area of expertise. And also that's going to be kind of exhausting the next 2 weeks. So I thought instead we'd give people a very futurist focused episode. Like, what are going to be the defining narratives and issues and frameworks that are going to define post 2024 November America, regardless of who wins? Before we kick into that, and this also relates to the topic then, I'd love for you to give a quick sum up of where you think we are after Abundance 2024. I emceed the event. We had a joint panel together on abundance factionalism. Love to get into that first, then get into futurism.
Yeah, I mean, so this was a big, I talk about it as a abundance jamboree that was bringing together all the people from what I think is still a sort of nascent social movement. So I think that's important to remember, that abundance is a little bit like one of these ideas that's a thin area of agreement with lots of stuff under theorized and people to some degree like competing for what the thing means. So everybody agrees that they're in favor of a thing called abundance, but I would almost think of it as a space for contestation. And so in that, there were a few people who were trying to make really strong claims about what this thing is and what it isn't. So, for example, my old friend Ted Nordhaus, again, because he can't help himself, always wants to start a fight. I always say that's sort of the breakthrough brand, is they're out there starting fights. But he made a really strong claim that abundance is inconsistent, at least with what we understand to be the legacy concept of environmentalism, right? So he was saying environmentalism is the enemy. Now, again, that's strong, and I think it was intended. And again, you have to kind of understand what Ted means. He didn't mean concern for the environment is the enemy, because that's not at all what he believes, right? But he believes
belief in climate change isn't the enemy,
right? But it's that environmentalism, as it's developed in the United States, includes in it a whole bunch of ideas that he understands to be directly in contrast with what people who believe in abundance believe, right? So, it very much comes out of that like era of limits, the idea that there's something almost spiritually wrong with the way that humans relate to climate and the environment more broadly, and that our job is simply to sort of not interfere or sort of withdraw as much as possible from the environment. Whereas his idea is, we have to manage the environment, right? He has that famous line that we are as his gods and we have to get used to it, right? That we are now entirely wrapped up with the management of every one of our natural systems. And that imagining that we can sort of withdraw or detract from it and that gets into the way we think about climate, right? That if you think that way, you're going to end up in a position of, say, like degrowth, right? Where the reason that we have climate change and all these other problems is that we've gotten addicted to the idea of economic growth, and we simply need to reduce our impact on the environment, right? Whereas the abundance idea is the idea that, in fact, no, we are part of the environment where we have to manage the environment, and we have to solve our environmental problems through technology, right? Through finding new ways to actually get energy, and especially super abundant energy, in a way that that both allows us to spread the benefits of modernity, right? So again, lots of people in the world don't have the really basic rudiments of modernity, like access to, 24/7 electricity, clean water, enough energy to actually, power industrialization, all of that stuff. And so that's why, again, Ted was making the argument that environmentalism, as we've come to understand it, has a completely opposite worldview to abundance, right? Whereas I think there are a lot of people there who think of themselves as environmentalists, right? Or at least in a legacy way, and are more into the idea that somehow that we can simply make environmentalism backward compatible with abundance. And so I think a lot of the subtext, the thing that was on the DL in this meeting, were people contesting over, in part, how radical they think the idea of abundance is, or whether there were a number of people who were just normie Democrats who kind of want to gradually move all this stuff in the direction of abundance without breaking any of the China of existing coalitional or ideological connections.
So
you saw when you were there?
So two things, one at a time. I think what's interesting here is actually three things. So first thing, what was so funny is folks obviously saw the moment of virality where Matt Yglesias was protested by climate defiance, the anti-fracking protesters. And ironically, Ted gave the speech you just articulated right before Matt. And I know, given Ted's personality, he was thinking, why am I not being protested? I wanted to be protested. Like, you could tell that the part of his speech where he said, environmentalism, the environmentalist movement, they're the enemy. That's when the climate protesters are supposed to charge the stage and then lose the Twitter battle. So that was just sort of a funny note, because Matt's talk had nothing to do with energy politics or climate politics or the managing of the coalition. So that was like a funny irony.
The audience that when the guys came on, so there were all these guys who like somehow got in the hotel and rushed on the thing when Derek Thompson and Matt Iglesias were talking, and then held up a bunch of moronic signs. And I remember sitting in the audience, I think it was next to Jerusalem Dimsis maybe, and I was like, oh my God, this is a Ted Nordhaus op. These people just work for Ted Nordhaus. Which again, this is why some of these guys are effectively self-satirizing. And that was one of the signs I saw. And actually, Ted wrote up a whole thing arguing later that these guys were not as marginal as you'd think, because they're funded by lots of mainstream environmental donors and stuff. So they weren't just a few marginal cranks. But
well, yeah, and I think that actually is the perfect lead-in, because I think it was a perfect compare and contrast. And I'm obviously not going to make, I disagree. I think tactically and strategically, Ted is too aggressive. And it's one of those things where if you sit Ted down and say to him, what do you mean by the environmental movement is the enemy? We can then have a conversation and you kind of get what he's saying, but just the headline from his perspective, because I think think tanks and policy organizations should be very, tip of the spear, very sharp. They're not trying to say like the Breakthrough Institute that doesn't have aggressive takes isn't as effective at what it's trying to do. So I'm not faulting him from the perspective of think tank leader. What I would say though is I would not pick that fight the way he fights it, because it's just it requires too much work. And I think the reason why abundance actually is a good framework, and I think the big tent abundance that we're at right now, is what we're trying to do is invite a bunch of people in and give them a new framework in the first hand. So I think the order of operations really matters here. But secondly, and this is what I think Ted, and I just did an episode with Alex Trembath that came out on this Tuesday that we're recording, where I basically said the thing that's really changed about Breakthrough Institute and eco-modernism and Ted's case is that the political debate has basically been settled. I genuinely believe the only way forward is the eco-modernist. How do we make growth compatible with clean energy and industrial transformation? The politics of, and that's the most biggest frustration thing with the protesters. It's not just the decorum. It's not the shouting Matt down and sort of like weird threateningness of it. It's that they don't have a coherent political case. You cannot advance an environmental politics that is premised on, during one of the tightest elections in recent American history, getting Kamala Harris to proclaim that her number one priority is shutting down fracking in Pennsylvania. It just doesn't work. It literally is not compatible with the coalitions and actual possibilities in American politics. Degrowth does not work. Inflation in energy prices does not work. We kind of have run this experiment over the past 4 years. And I think we're just part of the reason why we're just going to see more and more and more aggressive protests that are just divorced from an actual political actionability aspect. Is we kind of ran the test case for the past 10 to 15 years, and the case that they would basically make just doesn't actually work separate from the policy.
Well, so I actually think this is one of the interesting strategic questions to something you raise, which is, on the one hand, you could think of the thing that's good about abundance is its ambiguity, because its ambiguity brings in a lot of different kind of people who can make of it what they want and can do something creative with it. I think I'm closer to Ted's, and at least my proto presentation there was also trying to make a little more of a sharp line drawing argument. And this way, when Ted did his, I thought, I got to like one up Ted on being being aggressive. But part of this depends on what you think our time horizon is, right? And also what you're trying to organize. And so if I'm thinking what I'm trying to organize is at least in the beginning of a social movement, as a hardcore, right? And again, you're always going to be doing both, right? You've got some that's the hardcore, and then you have a bunch of people who are differentially affiliated to the thing that the hardcore people are arguing. But for me right now, the thing I'm most interested in is, how do you organize that hardcore? And when you're doing that, then you really are drawing lines, right? That this thing is the ritually pure abundance, and this thing is like trafe, right? And I think that's what both Ted and I were trying to do, is we were saying, I was saying, like, moderation is not ritually pure. That is not, in fact, what we're doing. And it's really important to have a distinction between that, because otherwise the whole thing will get wishy-washy. And especially if what you're trying to do is attract people to intense affiliation and intense engagement. One thing we know is you attract people to intense engagement not by watering things down, but by making things more pure, right? We know that about religion. That's why, liberal Protestantism has been in decline, because it can't attract people with a clear sense of what it is and what it's not, right? More. And so I think the same thing is true in social movements. And so that's why I think both of us were trying to make a little bit more of a line drawing thing, because what we still don't quite have is that hardcore central cadre of people who then can go out and evangelize and spread the good news of abundance and try and make distinctions clear. And so that's what I think both of us are doing. But, social movements obviously need to do both, right? They need to both, in the process of evangelizing, they're going to have to figure out how to talk to a lot of people who are not fully engaged, right? And that's a problem that some of these ideological movements have. I think a lot of the sort of DSA lefty factions sometimes had a hard time talking outside of their own bubble, right? People on the right often have that, where they discover that the things that they're all talking about on their 4chan or whatever, right, are just like not what like normies think. And so, one of our attractions is, I think we have a message that is in fact attractive to normies, but that doesn't mean that we as a social movement, we're always going to be a little more idiosyncratic, because we're going to be the kind of people who actually really care about fine distinctions and whether things work. And I think that's also because in public policy, there's a certain level of coherence that you have to figure it out in advance, or else you like run into contradictions that were papered over in the effort to sort of bring everybody on board. But then it turned out that you didn't actually cut some of those really hard do some of that really hard work at the ideological level. And then it turned out you had something that didn't work, in terms of the overall coherence of the project. So.
Yeah, and so many things to respond to. This is a fun because I was thinking, are you and I disagreeing, or do we just have different perspectives? I think we have different positions in this space. So, for example, because I'm a policy person who dabbles in media on the side, versus you're someone who academically studies social movements and the way that political ideologies like intersect with the political system, I think we have a different starting place. For example, here's just my objective that I'm very open about, and this is what I'm doing on the show. My goal isn't to, and I obviously want to work with you to build the cadres of abundance folks. What I'm looking to do, though, is basically do for abundance what center left to left people did for income inequality post financial crisis during the 2010s. So the key thing is, and I'm sure there's a good book on this or a good actual study of it, but 2011 onward, after Occupy Wall Street, just the default assumption, if you talk to just your median political reporter or news person or person who works on econ, is the great issue of American society after the financial crisis, after the George W. Bush era, is income inequality. That is the defining issue. There are a bunch of different responses to income inequality. You can say all these different things about it, whether or not it's an actual problem, whether or not there's something we can do at a policy level, but this is the defining issue, and everything in American politics needs to organize itself around it. What they then did with income inequality is say, and you do this well when you talk about progressive era, they say things like, look, in the same way that the New Deal and the progressive era were about capitalism, in this current age, the issue is, once again, income inequality. I think in a variety of ways, I don't think that was an active, it's not that income inequality wasn't a real serious policy and economic dynamic, but I think if we look at how events played out over the next 10 years, I would say the generic Elizabeth Warren to center-left income inequality articulation, and then the Bernie Sanders taking that idea to its logical conclusion via democratic socialism, were dead ends for a variety of levels. But then I'm then focused not on the political diagnosis, but just the idea of you're looking for an ominous story issue. And I'm just thinking to myself, if your average politician, especially on the Democratic side, they don't read policy books, not listening to the Ezra Klein show. But if you talk to them, and I did talk to them, they would just see the world through an income inequality lens. That's just the defining thing. I want your generic center left to center right politician with some weirdos to the further right and the further left who think of American politics through the lens of abundance. And I don't think that has anything to do with the cadre or the pointy spear part of your thing. So it's not that I'm disagreeing with you. It's just I think these are kind of separate projects, but here's what you think.
Well, I mean, I do think that part of what makes ideas go viral in the way that you're talking about is in part whether there are people giving pure, compelling versions of the argument, right? About why this is the central thing around which, everything ought to be debated. And just I want to go back to a second, because I remember I actually wrote but didn't publish an article about Elizabeth Warren back when she was the hot commodity. And I said,
quick question, what year? Because the year matters.
Oh God, this would have been, it was a while ago. It was right after she got elected to the Senate. So
okay, cool.
That was. And I said, it was going to be called something like Building a Better Elizabeth Warren. And that I actually think this fit with the argument that Brink Lindsay and I did in this book called The Captured Economy, that there was one version of Elizabeth Warren that was more purely populist. It was populist, but not the language about inequality, which is a much more niche-y actual language. That was more thoroughly about capture and cronyism and all of that stuff, right? And if you really take that language, it cuts both against private sector capture and public sector capture, right? And it got at a lot of what I think is the populist energy that's out there, is the sense that there are like elites who are feather bedding, who are using their power and existing status to replicate, to protect themselves from competition, to transfer their status intergenerationally, right? That's a really big language, right? And that's a language that's bigger than the left because it cuts in a whole bunch of different directions, right? It gets you some of the antitrust stuff, but it also gets you criticisms of higher education. It gets you criticisms of professions. It gets you criticisms of public sector unions, both teachers and cops, right? And one of the problems of that previous sort of moment is because I think the inequality frame became the thing that people were talking about, that was just too inherently ideologically narrow to be a kind of moment defining framework, right? In a way that I do think the capture framework actually has a lot more, because it just cuts in all these different directions and creates the opportunities for lots of weird, strange bedfellow coalitions. And so I do think abundance has some of that protean quality where it can cut a bunch of different ways. And it also, can go in a lot, it can go into a lot of different domains. And I think that was the other thing that was going on in the conference, is people were trying to sort of push around to see how far does this thing stretch. It's not just about that we can like build more solar, right? Or, that we need to be able to build infrastructure faster, or that it's about YIMBY and it's about how do we build housing more rapidly. And I also think more in a more diverse way, which is a different thing, right? So I think one of the things people are trying to figure out is how much of a Swiss Army knife is this thing, right? Mm-hmm. Which is about how many different public policies does it push you to think about there being different kinds of answers, right? Because and this is the thing, going back to the cost disease socialism paper that we've talked about before, the basic argument of that was, if you see high increasing cost domains, and you see that like that's causing lots of problems for people, what's your answer, right? The inequality answer is subsidy. We're going to help people more broadly buy those costs, those sort of supply constrained goods. And then the criticism we make in the piece is, well, no, because if that's what you do, all it does is exacerbate the cost, and then you're in an endless sort of spiral. And so one of the questions is, well, how far can you push that diagnosis, right? So it works, I think, very well in healthcare. And so we haven't actually been having as much of the conversation in abundance as being about health, but that's like the classically supply constrained domain. And it's also because it's so big, it has such a big effect on people's bottom lines. And we just know we've got decades of experience pouring more subsidy into healthcare and seeing it only drive up cost. And so one of the questions people are having is, okay, that works for housing, that works for healthcare, that, may work for these, but how far can you do it, right? Is abundance going to be something that's got a narrow jurisdiction, or does it have a broad jurisdiction? And saying that's the other thing people were playing with, is at some point when an idea like this goes viral, then everybody sort of piles on and says, actually, my thing, can be explained. And I think at some point people are going to have to ask, well, does it also explain things like public safety? And that's where, that's one of the things I think is still an open question. Is it in just these domains, or does it get into what you might think of as the more order maintenance kind of dimensions? Does it help you think about race and racial inequality in a different way? There's a bunch of those things that I think are still on the outer edge of this concept, and people are going to have to figure out whether this thing helps explain that yet.
Yeah, and I will say the area, since you and I both work at higher ed institutions, UT and Johns Hopkins, I think higher ed has a huge cultural valence opportunity with abundance, and it's just fascinating to think about, like, what are we actually fighting about when we're fighting about insane upper middle class striver parents paying tens and thousands of dollars to get their kids into like a second tier and into a below the A tier set of private colleges in the Northeast. Like, what's going on with all of these Northeastern parents shifting their kids towards like bigger Southern SEC schools? What's the fight over affirmative action and Asian Americans in the Ivy League? Like, it's all about constrained supply. And I think what's exciting about higher education, specifically with the abundance framework, is it kind of opens the moral imagination. And the University of Austin is kind of happening here in Austin. And I think there are parts of the University of Austin project that are just devastatingly and perhaps irrecoverably cringe. But there are parts that I think are compelling, like John Arnold's a center left. I'd say he's like alt center left in terms of his politics, but like, he's supporting University of Austin. And he gave a very compelling tweet response to a New York Times article, basically writing about that, where he basically says, look, you could have all sorts of qualms with their approach, but I'm just really compelled by someone starting something new. And I think that is a message that higher ed center left reformers need to be much stronger on, which is that, like, let's open the moral imagination. There is actually no reason why we would have this. Like, I get why Harvard wants there to be an incredibly constrained set of like seats for people who are trying to get in, but there's no reason why. I mean, Stanford's formed in the 1880s, 1890s. It's much newer than all these other schools are, but there's no reason why we can't do that. Yeah, so I just think so that's my moral imagination point.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this is about what your default theory of what an answer looks like, right? So again, I think in the university thing, it's not just, it's funny, we talk a lot about this at Hopkins and I'm in the SNF Agora Institute now, where we talk a lot about these questions, especially about higher education. And, one of that is the higher education is about, economic opportunity and social mobility. And so one of the questions is, why do we have sort of supply constraints about the things that help people get social mobility? And do we need to think about different kinds of ways to get training that aren't universities, right? So one of our supply constraints is that we mostly think that the thing that we have to do is somehow expand a thing that looks like a university, right? But if we imagine lots of different kind of models, not even just like community colleges, but totally other kind of platforms that would also not have the grifty qualities that a lot of the sort of private, for-profit stuff has. But the other way, if you think about University of Austin, they're not mainly solving that social mobility problem. They're not mainly trying to solve for how do we create an institution that gets people in who, weren't in and gives them skills, right? They're trying to solve a problem that they think that the incumbents in higher education are providing a kind of education that is more limited, right? That incorporates lots of ideological stuff, right? And the problem is in a supply constrained environment, what that means is that critique has to mostly manifest itself as complaining, right? Mm-hmm. So what conservatives mostly do in the absence of being able to make stuff is they complain and they're like, oh, University of Texas, so woke, whatever, right? Whereas what you'd really like people to do is to say, if you don't like it, go just make something else, right? And then we'll judge you not by your tweets. We'll judge you by whether the thing actually works. And so that's my feeling about University of Austin is I'm like, I don't know. It doesn't sound like the kind of thing I would have done. But go ahead and do it and either succeed or fail, right? That's a abundance approach, is to say, we'll judge you by what actually happens. We're going to loosen up supply constraints. We're going to let you actually go and do it. And if you do it and it turns out that all you guys created was something that didn't progress past the intellectual dark web, well, then we'll know it, right? And we can all say that. And so a lot of abundance, I think, is also, though, cuts on this cultural dimension in a way that people underestimate, which is to say that, one of the basic problems of American life is that we're more plural than our institutions are, right? And that what you want are institutions that are as plural as the people that they're serving. And so the only way to do that is to allow more entry in lots of areas. And I think of this pluralism dimension, which is different than the abundance dimension, as also manifesting in housing. So we're in Agora, in the center that I run for now at Agora, we're doing a project called the Architecture of Pluralism, which is about thinking about housing, not just in terms of like more or less, which is the classic abundance model, but that the problem is there's just too much similarity in the kinds of things we're building, right? We're not actually building the incredible diversity of ways for people to live together that would allow us to manage some of our cultural conflict, right? By just saying, oh, let's allow, people want to live in single family houses in the suburbs like you, and people who want to live in like group homes or share family, raising, or have super trad religious communities who are all sort of living together, right? One of our problems is our housing stock is not as plural as our population is. And I think the same thing is true in universities. And so I think there's actually a lot of places where the abundance framework can be understood as pushing into the cultural domain, but pushing into it by opening up a space for pluralism as opposed to culture war, right? A culture war imagines that we're going to settle this thing by having like winners and losers, and somebody's just going to be defeated and be the subordinate population, right? As opposed to making it easier for people to actually create spaces, physical or institutional, that sort of match up with their underlying values.
Yeah, that's really well stated. And I haven't thought of the pluralism aspect, but even, and this has always been, I'm always very precise to say that I don't identify as a YIMBY, because I think, and this is where the social movement thing happens, and it's probably a good thing from a YIMBY perspective that like they're not bringing in people like me who are sort of like friendly but not like are aligned, versus like the pointy sphere activists who are willing to go to an actual city planning meeting. I think YIMBYism, especially the online activist variety, is just way too certain about a certain vision of what American urbanism should look like. So too much anti-car stuff, too much anti-highway stuff. And yes, I know that when we expand the highway, it doesn't actually solve the traffic problem. But from a political pluralism perspective, it's just sort of like, look, to be honest with you, there's just a whole variety of Americans who have made very clear that they will still take that 40-minute commute to their exurb, even if you can't perfectly within a 10-year time scale get that commute down to 25 to 30 minutes by adding a new line. But I just think too often, like YIMBYism, I just like YIMBYism within the pluralistic framework you established, which is like, look, guess what? Like religious trad cath, like getaway, I've been invited to a couple. It's not for me. It's not my thing. I'm not going to move out into the hill country and do that here in Texas, but that's perfectly okay. And I don't think I need to make arguments against that. I just think that people should be allowed to try and here's actually the point. If it's not possible for people to do that, I would like it to make it possible for people to do that, right? So if there are unfair incumbent like land use regulations that make it impossible for my right-wing friends to build like Trumpy compounds, I think that's a problem. I think that should be like not allowed by law, but that doesn't require me to then argue, actually, guys, wouldn't you be much happier if we had these like very, very aesthetic inner city, not inner city, inner ring of the city condos that share the same backyard and give you the same feeling of, I'm not trying to have that argument because it's not going to be effective.
Yeah, and again, I this is one where why I think it's really important. Why pluralism as an answer to our cultural problems fits with the overall abundance framework. And I think one of the problems with abundance is, at least in its initial form, the language of it was too economic, right? And so it was viewed as having just very narrow jurisdiction, right? Which is the concept people use in sociology, right? It's only, whereas if you think about the underlying problem we have culturally is the idea that people can't imagine any way of living with people who disagree with them, except by somehow eliminating them, right? Or keeping them from being able to do the thing, right? But we are a big, hugely pluralist society, right? So again, this is why I think at least some of the ed reform stuff in its better version back in the 90s and 2000s was the precursor of abundance in its best form, because on the one hand, it was emphasizing more, right? Not just letting people choose between existing schools, right? But creating new schools, right? And so much of that, the work of the foundations and people in there was like, how do we actually allow people to go build new schools, prove their point, not by this, right? But by actually doing something, and then we can judge whether that school is any better. We can judge whether your KIP or Uncommon or whatever school is better than the other thing, instead of just doing this and tweeting and criticizing people, right? And the ideal of school choice was to allow people to align their underlying values with their schools, because in fact, people have fundamentally different ideas about what constitutes an educated person. There's no way to settle that purely through expertise or professionalism.
Once we've advanced beyond, the early 20th century, reading, writing, arithmetic, once that's no longer the underlying thing we're trying to do with our schooling, like help people who didn't have anything but an 8th grade education, we're in these more intangible areas. And I think it's been very hard for the education establishment to wrap its head around that.
Yeah, but again, that's where I think if you think about that, it's both more and it's more plural. Those are the two basic things that I think give this thing the most spread, right? And again, also allow it to move out. Again, I think your criticism of YIMBY as in some ways having been captured by the conditions of its original formation.
San Francisco being a disaster in LA.
Look, and that criticism is entirely appropriate in that context. But there's lots of other things. This is where I think, we're going to be running another conference called Beyond YIMBY next year. And part of the idea is that we need to push this YIMBY beyond just the narrow thing of like more to more of what, right? And allowing, and one of those is, Americans used to go and create entire new towns and cities, right? I mean, Salt Lake City, like people went over and, when they got kicked out of Indiana and places like that, right? And they were like, okay, we're just going to go and not try and make the rest of society be tolerant of our crazy ideas. We're just going to go and create a whole new place, right? This is the place. That's the Salt Lake City, right? And they proved, right, then now Salt Lake City is a great city, right? It's not purely Mormon anymore, but it was a place that people created, right? And I think part of abundance is also allowing people to create entirely new spaces that to some degree embody their different weird values, right? Both rad and trad. And that's also, I think, an answer to some of our problems of having supply constrained economic goods, but also we have a constraint on pluralism. And then the second part is the thing that people really have not been getting at and this is again why I think I don't like the moderation frame. This is where this is like my obsession is that.
No, this is good. This is your pointy spear. This is it.
Is in some ways, I actually think this movement is quite radical, but it's radical on a different dimension than the standard left-right is. It's got a different set of obsessions, and that's where a lot of change happens in political history, is somebody intruding a new dimension into politics to say, look, we were all arguing about whether we should just have gold or gold and silver. And, and that was like the central, should we regulate railroads or not regulate railroads? And so, no, a lot of progressives were like, no, we're going to introduce this whole reform dimension, which is going to cut across a bunch of these others. And what we want is eventually everybody talking about this, right? And you're going to have disagreements within that new dimension, but it is going to be a new dimension. People are going to be focusing on a bunch of problems that seemed marginal in the older left-right dimension, right? And we may just call that new thing at some point some new left-right, but it won't be a left-right that was on the thing we were talking about before. It'll be on all of these new issues. So issues like, the organization and productivity of science, right? Nobody really thought that was like a central top tier issue in the standard left-right of the 70s and 80s and 90s. But I argue that, people in this space really should be thinking about this as a top tier issue, because so many of the rest of the things that relate to economic growth and productivity and everything are all downstream from the productivity science. And so one of the things that abundance is going to do is it's going to intrude these issues and say, no, this is a tier 1 issue. It's not a tier 2 or tier 3 issue.
Yeah. So I want to hit one thing and then let you take us out on just sort of, you referenced futurism. I want you to just give folks let's give some people some news to use. Like I'd love you to just to apply your futurist concept to how people should think about the next 2 weeks and then the period moving outwards. So we'll close there. I'll let you collect your thoughts. But just one thing I'd love to talk about. So I thought our panel that we were both on factionalism was really great. I did get one not negative note, but it was a note of frustration that I've been thinking about. I was told by someone of relevance that you and I were way too bearish on the center right to conservative prospects for the abundance movement. My quick thing there, because we could get into our specific critiques here, is this is where we start getting into like this effort of trying to make the tent too big in a way that makes it ineffective. I think there's a real urge from people who are attracted to moderation as the end all be all to sort of start with, how do we make this perfectly bipartisan? What's the version of this that I could chop to like a conservative center? And what's the version that I could chop to like a left-wing senator? And from my perspective, I just don't think that's how policy change has activated itself the past few years. And I said this on our panel, but I'm always just going to think about how Trump changed the consensus on China policy. It's basically the default way you should approach these intellectual idea spaces, actually converting people who don't think with these issues every day. 2015, Trump upends the China consensus. No one agrees with this. It's very radical. There's a very bipartisan stand against it. But and once again, this is where I'm not trying to give too much credit to Trump, but like to give credit to Trump, the questions he raised about the effect of the post-Cold War order when it came to US and China were actually taken up by serious people who weren't with him and started saying to themselves, oh, wow, wait, actually, this isn't working. Oh, wow, wait. And now we now have a Biden administration, which has largely adopted the Trump, not the playbook specifically, but they're animated by some of the same questions when it comes to trade, military competition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the best move you should make from a political social movement is identify a strong coalition or set of institutions that you can then convince, capture, pick whatever word you want to use to describe it. And then if you get the framework right and the questions and some of the answers correct, then this will be much, much more attractive. So that's kind of like my take and why I'm not basically kicking myself saying, man, I wished I perfectly gave this vision of a version of this you could shop to like a conservative member of Congress in like Missouri. But I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah. So there were about 3.5 questions embedded in here. So I'm just going to. That
was more of a statement question.
I'm going to pick the one I want to answer. So one of it is, again, and I get this all the time, that people are like, "Oh, you keep talking about this about a thing in the Democratic Party, and that abundance is." And I think, one, I want to defend myself, and then I want to attack myself. So I'm going to defend myself by saying, in a factional sense, I think it's absolutely accurate, because in big cities where there's no party competition, the battle between the sort of standard issue left, right, which is actually now pretty hard left, right, and the forces that I think of as abundance, right, that's actually happening, right? People are actually organizing their politics in cities like that, all the way down to the little suburban town, lefty town that I live in, outside of Maryland, right? There really is an actual politics that's organized around NIMBYs and YIMBYs, right? That is a real thing. That's not something that people like you and I have to concoct in our brains, right? That fight's actually going on. And, there's questions about, well, how much is going to get added into that conflict, and, is it just going to be about housing, or is it going to be about energy, or whatever it is, right? But that's already happening. In the Republican Party, you do have to kind of imagine it. So I think that's one thing is I think you already have the thing that is a factional conflict occurring in the Democratic Party, and the divide in the Republican Party is not right now mostly organized like that.
And one quick thing before you attack yourself, and this is where I think the audience response matters here. It should be noted. So that as I've mentioned, there are plenty of people who reach out after we do these episodes. At a staffer level, there have been a bunch of GOP staffers in Congress who work on science and technology related issues. They've reached out about the abundance agenda, but the vast majority, we're talking like 90-10 of people who've reached out from these like in real life situations are, I'm an ambitious young Democrat who's looking to find ways to navigate the dynamics you're describing. So I think that's just like my personal illustration of like what you're describing there. I have not had a single, and once again, if you're listening, I know you probably are, reach out to me. I have not had a center right to conservative, ambitious political actor outside of DC reach out to me about the abundance agenda and what they can do with it. So that's just like my personal anecdote that I'll reach out there.
Yeah. So you should definitely hit Marshall up. And I've heard again, I think there is a lot of people who are at that staffer level, right? That, I meet them all the time. They reach out to me. That's an actual, now part of that is because these are people who have to they do have to go in the office and do something. They can't just vibe all day. So they want to do something. And I also think a lot of those people, many of them come out of a more libertarian, at least they have that libertarian set. And there's a version of libertarianism that at least rhymes with abundance. So, I've been, I was actually just doing another podcast with Virginia Postrel, who I do think of as like the St. John the Baptist of abundance, right? The idea of dynamism really was an earlier version of this. And she was really clear that the dynamism was not just it wasn't just another way of redescribing libertarianism, right? That it was an actual just other dimension. Okay, so that's roundabout. So here's the criticism is I do think that abundance will not look the same in the Republican Party as it looks in the Democratic Party. Again, because in the Democratic Party, so much of it emerges out of an actual conflict, right? That starts somewhere in the way that progressivism started in big cities where they were battling against party machines. And that really defined what progressivism was. I do think this point I was making about pluralism may be more of the way that parts of the Republican Party ends up getting into abundance, right? Is that I think, the people who are creating these civic thought schools in places like University of Texas and Florida and lots of places like that, right? I think of that as a version of abundance, right? That we're going to stop just saying that liberals are bad and that the culture war is a thing that all happens at the vibe level. We're going to start working in the material world about actually making something, right? If we don't like the way our communities look, we're just going to go create new communities that embody the way that we think things are in schools. And you can keep going down through that. I actually think some of that abundance stuff in the Republican Party is going to have more of that cultural dimension. And that cultural dimension, however, is going to manifest in things that actually exist in the material world. And I think that's where the obsession, and that some of that is going to need some of the same kinds of regulatory context, right? You're going to need to deregulate housing if you're going to allow people to go out and create new communities and things with shared yards and shared daycares and all kind of other stuff, right? But I actually think abundance is going to look more cultural in the Republican Party. And it'll also be more, but on the other hand, the thing where I think they might actually have more success is the drag in the Republican Party on some of these abundance is just a lot less, right? In the Democratic Party, let's say you were trying to deregulate science and you were trying to, get rid of institutional review boards in universities, right? All those lobbies for that stuff are all in the Democratic Party, right? So if you're trying to do that, you've got to do hand-to-hand combat against people in your own side, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're a Republican administration and you come in, you're like, wow, IRB is really bad. There's like nobody in your own administration who's going to be like, well, actually, IRB is really good and we run it and stuff, right? And you can think about that, multiplying that across a lot of different dimensions, that you can imagine a Republican administration actually doing a lot of abundancy stuff in a way that's a lot easier if they actually just get control of the administrative structure. Now, they're also probably going to do a lot of absolutely crazy stuff, right? But there's more stuff you can imagine them doing because they're not in there with like Gulliver with all the Lilliputians tying them down, which is kind of the way that the coalition of the Democratic side works.
So you've got a heart out in 3.5 minutes. So take this question as long as you want to take it till your heart out. I'll hit pause on the imagining futurism thing because that's actually a better opening topic for our post-election. We'll have an election result and then we could frame the like futurist thing within that context. So here's my quick question. As I was thinking about the critique of us not indulging enough center-right visions of the future, here's the obvious question. Is it possible that abundance on the right looks like Elon Musk and like the American Dynamism Mark Andreessen crew? Because the funny thing is that like that if you actually look at what they're basically saying, it's the abundance agenda. I still think Time to Build, Mark's essay from early COVID, is probably like the best succinct articulation of why we need to build, why there should be more things, critiquing the status quo, the energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Elon's doing the space stuff and talking about how government agencies don't let him actually build the things he's trying to build. Is the increasing right-leaning turn of these parts of the tech right going to create an opportunity for there to be an abundance part of the coalition on the right?
Yeah, I mean, it could. Right? I mean, again, one of the problems, the thing I mentioned, is that the language of Trumpism and MAGA is a very zero-sum language, and this is where, and I think that is a problem, right? Again, you think about all the issues with Springfield, Ohio, right? That's a very zero-sum world to be thinking about, as opposed to thinking about, we actually could be taking in tons more immigrants if our basic systems worked, if like housing adjusted more rapidly, if we train people in English, if we train people to drive, and we'd actually, these basic state things work better, we wouldn't have so many of these zero-sum conflicts. Whereas the MAGA thing is really like very hardwired to find and then frame things in zero-sum ways. And that's just not the way the abundance language does, right? But I do think there is a version of it that is more like the tech right, which is not as much of what I'm describing as sort of the pluralism vision of abundance that's more going to be attractive to parts of cultural conservatism, right? At least the normie parts of cultural conservatism. But I do think that there are, at least at the elite level, that's a real thing. And again, they have fewer constraints inside their own coalition. Mm-hmm. If Elon Musk, now again, my suspicion is they don't actually have the sophistication at the level of governing elites to do a lot of this stuff, right? And then one of the advantages of doing abundance in the Democratic Party is if you persuade all the, a large part of this expert cadre of this, then there's a big expert cadre who can actually go and staff government administrations and stuff. And whereas the Republican Party, part of the abundance agenda, I think, is also helping build a expert cadre on the right who actually can run a modern state, but in this more pluralistic and abundant way.
Perfect place to end. Steve, this has been really great. And we, of course, did the important podcasting art of not making any election predictions. Nope. So that after the election, we go over the results, we can say, I had an inkling of this. This reflects a thought that I privately didn't share with anyone. So that'll be fun.
Well, I was thinking maybe, after the election, when they're taking over the radio stations and seizing the armories, then this podcasting may occur from a lead-lined underground bunker. So we don't really know that quite yet.
You may have just offered a prediction of who you think is going to win the election, but we'll leave it there. Thanks
I'm
for
not
joining
saying we're
us.
taking over the armories. I'm leaving that open.